When this woman stepped into the workshop of her deceased husband, she had no idea her life was about to change forever. She always had a certain image of him. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. He was the kind, loving partner she had been married to for almost 50 years, but then she found out he lied their entire life. The old woman's depressive state was unhealthy, and even though her daughters felt the pain of loss as well, they still tried to encourage their mother to move on. They noticed Margaret's sadness was directly linked to their father's old stuff, so they needed to go or at least be relocated. Margaret was hesitant because most of these items held deep meaning to her, but there was one room in the house that was different: her husband William's workshop. It was his own sanctuary, the place where he kept his woodworking tools and other larger equipment. "Maybe I can start there," she said carefully. Margaret hardly ever came there. It was a place he had to himself, but according to Margaret's daughter, it would make a lovely guest room for the grandchildren when they slept over. Margaret walked to the workshop and naively felt tears streaming down her face. Inside were mostly tools and a large workbench, but there were also tons of pictures with the two of them together on it, and Margaret felt love in her heart at that moment. But would that remain once she figured out his secret? Because what Margaret did not know was that this workshop was actually a front for something completely different. The secret that her husband had kept from her their entire lives. The workshop held a hidden room, the entrance concealed by one simple object, but Margaret was about to discover it. The entrance to this secret room was right before the old woman. Only one object prevented her from spotting it straight away, but not for long. Margaret started her cleaning job by organizing her husband's tools. She grabbed them off his workbench and arranged them by size before putting them into boxes. The old woman braced herself and started pushing with as much force as possible, and then she saw it. Margaret was able to move the bench away from the wall a bit, making the space behind it visible for the first time in many years. But on that wall, Margaret noticed something odd. Then there were thin seams visible on this wall. They were connected in a rectangular shape, forming some sort of door. "What is that?" Margaret said with a curious tone in her voice. Margaret pushed the workbench a bit more so it would clear the door completely. And then she edged closer. Margaret let her fingers pass over the edges of this mysterious door, and after that first touch, she pushed. The door wasn't even taller than 3 feet, so it was easily hidden behind the workbench. But the noise it made when it opened up was that of a heavy-duty door. Margaret looked inside but unfortunately couldn't see much. Oh, she had to use her other senses to scan the mysterious space behind the workshop wall. She crawled inside and used her fingertips to feel her surroundings. The space was larger than she initially thought. She could move around and spread her arms without touching anything. While still completely blind, Margaret started using her touch to feel around the room. She picked up multiple objects and blindly tried to determine what they were. The unknowing aspect of this place made the old woman nervous a bit, so a light source needed to be found as soon as possible. Usually, a light switch can be found close to an entrance door, Margaret said to herself. She turned around and faced the hole she had crawled into. From there, the always-cold woman started touching up the wall until she eventually found something that resembled a switch. But when the flickering stopped and the room was lit, Margaret looked around with wide-open eyes. The old woman was in awe of what she witnessed, and shivers ran all over her spine as she explored the hidden space. "What is all of this?" she spoke out loud, trying to make sense of it all. The room hidden behind the workshop wall wasn't like anything Margaret had ever seen before. It resembled a small museum with very old memorabilia everywhere. Her husband clearly kept the room and its objects in good shape because it was far less dusty than the rest of the workshop outside. After a quick scan, Margaret walked up to the main wall. There, she saw many framed pictures of her husband in his younger years. She estimated that he was in his early 20s. It was from before they met. He posed with many other men, but Margaret drew a blank when looking at them. In most of these pictures, the men wore uniforms resembling those worn in wartime. Her husband, William, was dressed in uniform as well. Margaret squinted her eyes and read the insignia on Williams's outfit. It's Vietnam 1968, it read. But strangely enough, Margaret couldn't remember her husband ever fighting in a war. It was like the old widower was learning about her husband for the first time. She thought she knew the man she loved through and through, but now he seemed like a stranger to her. The discoveries did not end with the framed pictures because the piece, the resistance, was hanging in the center. It was her husband's uniform. Margaret recognized it instantly because the war and the date were the exact same as in the pictures. William's name was also embroidered on the collar. The uniform had tons of medals hanging on it, and the person gifting her husband those awards was also present. Why did William never tell Margaret anything about this clearly important time in his life? They were married for almost 50 years, and he had never brought up this time in his life once. Margaret eventually stepped out of the room with confusion written all over her face. She needed to find out more. Margaret wanted to know everything she could about her husband's secret life. More importantly, she wanted to know why he kept it from her for all those years. Luckily for the old woman, she had a clear plan on where to start. In some notebooks she also found in the hidden room were phone numbers. Margaret's initial guess was that these might belong to her fellow soldiers posing with her husband in the pictures. So, without a moment of hesitation, Margaret reached for her phone and started calling the numbers one by one. She hoped that the number would still work, though. Her phone rang. Margaret's prayers were answered. Now, the first number called was answered, and a person picked up on the other end. He introduced himself as a man named John. When he heard who Margaret was and why she was calling, he was just as surprised as she was. The two individuals got straight to business. John explained that Margaret's husband indeed was part of the Vietnam War. Apparently, William was a true wartime hero. He pulled off some incredible deeds and showed tremendous courage in a truly dire time. He saved my life more than once, John proudly stated. John explained that William was a field medic, not the kind who waited on the sidelines for wounded men to return. William went with them to the battlegrounds. During one of the most intense battles of the war, he carried wounded soldiers away from the heat of battle, risking his own life in the process. Not only that, he was a true inspiration and a voice of calm and reason in those troublesome times, John said. After a quick chat, John suggested that Margaret call the other soldiers. Margaret couldn't agree more and immediately started dialing. And with every person who answered, the widower got the same answer. But that question would not be unanswered for long, because the last person on the list had all the answers she sought. The ex-soldier and friend to whom the number belonged was named Tom. He also asked Margaret to come over, which, of course, Margaret replied swiftly. He'd be there in 10 when Margaret entered. Tom shook Margaret's hand and quickly laid out the foundations of her relationship with William. He explained that the war was a very traumatic experience for Margaret's husband. William often called me after having vivid nightmares about his years in service. The memories kept haunting him even after intensive therapy. Something needed to change, and we all knew it. William cut ties with each and every one of us. It was hard on him and hard on us as well. I missed my friend every day, but I knew it was in his best interest that I kept away. I hoped that William could go on with his life in peace by doing so. Tom looked at Margaret and smiled. By looking at you, I think he succeeded. Margaret slowly started understanding why her husband hid this part of his life. It was just too hard for him to dwell on his troubled past. Margaret felt so sorry for her husband, though. The pain he must have kept inside. Tom then stated that he already knew about Margaret. William never sought out contact, so the news did not come from him. Margaret said that they had a happy life together. She just missed him very much ever since his passing. But there is one thing I still don't understand. Why would he keep a memorabilia room if these times were so traumatic? Tom didn't understand that part either, but he did have a request. And apparently Margaret's husband did so too. Without telling anyone, especially not his therapist, who would not have approved, William kept detailed mementos of his time in the war. Tom again felt an immediate connection with his long-lost friend, and then he said something amazing. The old man turned toward Margaret. He had a thankful look in his eyes and wanted to repay the favor. Tell me what you want to know about your husband. I have nothing but time and plenty of stories to tell, the old soldier stated. Margaret nodded with a broad smile, and they traded in the workshop for the living room. They sat and talked for hours on end. Margaret provided the tea and cookies, and Tom took care of the stories. There was a ton of information about William to tell, and each heroic and emotional story was more captivating than the former. She loved him, but she also felt a deep sense of sadness toward her late husband. He had to keep these secrets locked away, and if the room was any indication, he wanted those times to be a part of his life somehow. What strength it must have taken to keep these feelings bottled up. It says in the month after their first meeting, Tom came by multiple times. His knowledge about Margaret's late husband was too much to convey in a single afternoon. Every time they met, more stories about William's bravery popped up. The senior individuals laughed and cried together and even became close friends. On October 2nd, about a year after William's passing, Margaret found the strength to visit his grave alone for the first time. Before this date, she always needed relatives to come along, but now she could do it alone. She placed a hand on his grave and thanked the love of her life for everything.